So hi, I'm Gary Hamill. I'm joined by my colleague, Michele Zanini, and welcome to the New Human Movement. We're so glad you've joined us. Obviously, hit the like button, subscribe, get notifications. We'd like you to be part of this conversation. Today, we have an extraordinary pleasure. We're here talking with Professor Jeff Pfeffer from Stanford. I don't know anybody who's written for more years, more persuasively, with more data about people at work and how do we make that, how do we make jobs that literally are worth having. There's just nobody who has more to say about that. And maybe there are people who are more insightful. I'm not sure who they are. Maybe there are people who've been more prolific. I'm not sure who they are. And if you haven't read Jeff's books, all of them are worth reading. Dying for a Paycheck, Leadership BS. We're going to start with a book that Jeff wrote years ago, Building Competitive Advantage Through People. So welcome, Jeff, and thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you, and let's just jump right into it. So Michele and I were going back and looking at your substantial body of work. And when you wrote Competitive Advantage Through People, which, by the way, I don't know how else you build competitive advantage. It seems like that's the obvious way to do it. But based on a lot of data, you outlined 13 kind of work practices that we just know create economic value. And you talked about job security, giving people a financial upside, having more autonomy, investing in skills, information transparency, things that just, I think, make sense to all of us. Yeah, this is the way you create economic value and you make work better. So yet, I think you would also argue, and you did argue, years on, that very few organizations have really adopted those practices in any systematic way. So maybe Jeff, talk to us a little bit about what's the case for adopting these practices and why have so few organizations done it, in your opinion?
Well, the case for adopting them is actually stronger than when I wrote the book, which was now decades ago. I mean, the data continues to come in, as you yourself said, which is kind of interesting. How else would you build a competitive advantage in a knowledge-based economy except through people? And there's certainly a lot of evidence that suggests that there's a 30 to 40% probably upside from having people in what is sometimes called high commitment or high performance work arrangements, where they have, where you've selected them carefully to fit the organization, where, as you said, they get trained and skilled, and they get decision-making autonomy, because what's the point of having skilled people if you don't let them make any decisions? And you put them in teams, and you give them some financial upside from the value they're creating. And when you do all these things together, the evidence in a bunch of industry studies and in some multi-industry studies demonstrates, significant financial returns, both in terms of productivity and stock price and everything else. And why organizations haven't done it is, I think, who knows, but I think there are many reasons. I think one reason is because so I wrote a case on Kimberly-Clark in the Andean region, and I met this guy, Sergio Nakac, who had basically run this incredible, in these 5 little, very poor Andean region countries, had produced basically 19% of the growth in the huge Kimberly-Clark's upside. And I said, why doesn't everybody do what you do? And he said, because, they were all trained as basically an accountants in finance, and so they don't believe it. And a colleague of mine, who you would know, the name Carl Weick, he turned around the idea that seeing is believing, and to believing is seeing. That if you don't believe something, you won't see it. I have a friend whose wife died of breast cancer because they did not believe that she was had the genetic predisposition to have breast cancer, and that she was too young to have breast cancer. So when they got the MRI that actually showed the breast cancer, they did not see it, literally. So believing is seeing. And so if you don't believe in this stuff, you will be skeptical, and the evidence isn't going to convince you very well.
So, Jeff, let me just stop you there, right there, and let's talk about the evidence for a moment, because as you say, the evidence is kind of unimpeachable. Let me share some evidence. So Glassdoor, the online site where employees rate their companies, Glassdoor every year does their ranking of the 100 best companies to work for. And it's kind of interesting, in one of the most recent years, about 2/3 of the companies on the list were privately held companies. Maybe we come back to that, or I guess slightly over 50%.
No, by the way, that's consistent with the best place to work list also. The
Yeah.
Fortune Best Place to Work, the Best Place to Work Institute, who also has their ranking, but about 2/3 of them are private also.
But having said that, here's the interesting thing: if you take out the publicly listed companies, I think, and I think this was the 2019 list I was looking at. But if you take out the publicly listed companies, which I think were 40 something, about 40 companies, over the previous 5 years, their financial performance, they returned 183% total gains to shareholders, and that was versus the S&P 500, which was 43%. So now we can debate causality in that, and for sure we can come back to that. But it is an extraordinary, organizations that treat their people well, that do exactly what you argue they should do, have this extraordinary performance advantage. And when you look at the Fortune data, they have their own list that they've been running like for some years. You find the same long-term effects. They just systematically do better than organizations who haven't adopted these enlightened practices. So I'm just making the point that you do have a lot of evidence on your side, so it suggests that you almost have to be willfully blind.
I think organizations are, so much of the things that we've talked about, you can't do just one at a time. You have to do them as a system. So if I recruit carefully, but then I don't train the people, you don't get all the advantages. If I recruit them and train them, and as I just said, if I don't delegate, which is your favorite topic, which I love also, if I recruit skilled people and train them and invest in them and don't let them make any decisions, it's not going to do me much good. So you have to do all of these things, and I think it's a system. And, I think people don't look at system change as something that they want to really do. They want to do something quick. I want to put in, some incentive scheme, or I want to downsize, or I want to, hire McKinsey or Bain or somebody. The idea of doing, I have a friend who transformed Stanford Healthcare, which is the hospital. And by the way, as soon as he left as CEO, it went back. And I said to him, and it was extraordinary. I mean, when he came in to run Stanford Healthcare was in the 5th percentile in the emergency department. They were in the 40th percentile in patient satisfaction. When he left, they were in the 90th percentile on both. Profits had gone from about 80 million a year to 500 million a year. Revenues had doubled, and this is healthcare. We're not talking about Google. And and I said to him, why doesn't everybody do what you do? And he said, it requires patience and discipline. And Gary, you have worked with enough CEOs to know that everybody wants the fancy, big, fast idea, that the idea of do something patient, discipline, calm, step at a time. What is the saying? The perfect is the enemy of the good. It requires, as opposed to big strategic initiatives and all this other stuff, it requires basically patience and discipline. It requires focus. And all of that requires, an attention to detail that is missing for many people.
So there's two things there, Jeff, you said that I think are interesting. One, you said that these work practices comprise a system, that this is not an a la carte menu, that
Yes.
The empowerment, the training, the information transparency, the egalitarianism, having fewer wage differentials, this all works together. So that I took number one. Number two, I hear you by implication saying, like, starting at a brownfield and doing this and building this kind of environment, culture, if you like, is slow and laborious work, and that for many leaders there just seem to be easier and more immediate ways of popping the share price.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would add Jeff, and based on also things you've written about power, that this is a politically difficult choice, right, for people who have done well by the status quo, the current system, to pursue, right, because it means reducing their their own influence, their own power, or their own at least positional authority, potentially reducing their pay and their pay of their buddies, in the various staff functions that have grown and who are now, running the firm in a more centralized way. And so, what is it? What is the saying that turkeys don't vote for Christmas or Thanksgiving, right? I mean, isn't that part of the problem as well?
Yes, I think that is, of course, part of the problem. And when you see the Business Roundtable, which last year came out with this declaration of how everything was going to be different, it's a joke because they did not say they were going to change how executives were compensated. So if you say we're not going to have shareholder primacy, but I'm going to still compensate my executives essentially on stock price, which is how they're still compensated, nothing's going to change.
Mm-hmm.
So why, Jeff, just on that for a moment, why? Talk to me your views on CO compensation and where does that fit into all of this and trying to create better places to work. How does that fit in?
Well, as you know, people do what they're rewarded for doing. So, one of the things that I firmly believe, though I'm clearly in my very small minority, is that human health and human well-being, both physical and psychological, is important. And that we should, one of the reasons why we abolished slavery was not because it was economically inefficient, but because it was morally repugnant. One of the reasons why we abolished child labor was not because you couldn't make more money exploiting children, as some countries still do, but because this was immoral. In a similar way, I think you have to prioritize at some level human well-being, psychological and physical health. And by the way, one of the arguments I've made in Dying for a Paycheck, and one of the arguments I made in the recent McKinsey thing on mental health, is that if you really want to cut healthcare costs, which every advanced industrialized country is doing, you have to do this through fixing the workplace. I mean, this is a source of stress and depression, which is now, even prior to COVID, but now with COVID, is in epidemic proportions. There's evidence, physiological evidence, very good epidemiological evidence, that stress and depression cause other diseases such as cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. And the mechanisms are pretty well known. Number one, if you are depressed and stressed, you're going to engage in poor physical, activities. You're going to eat too much and drink too much and smoke too much and not exercise enough and take illicit drugs. That's number one. And number two, they have actually now demonstrated the connection between stress and depression in both instances and the operation of your immune system and inflammation and other things. So if we are serious about having a healthier society and reducing healthcare costs, we have to fix the workplace. And that's also, not that surprising if you think about it. And once again, you don't see priorities for this. So you see, and I think I wrote something about this once, you see the list of the most admired CEOs and you see the list of the best companies to work, and there's not much overlap. So we got admired companies like Amazon, which has been, pilloried for their work practices, and you get these other places. And so until we have an alignment of interests around things that we really prioritize, they're not going to get much priority.
So you think, Jeff, the leverage point is almost to make an analogy with pollution. So like health is sort of the externality, right? Poor health outcomes that these practices generate, and that's how we rally the troops around this cause, right? And it also will eventually make companies more productive. But going through
hugely.
But you're saying, if I get you correctly, is that it's a much more productive or much more fruitful conversation to have, the one around social priorities, around health and other social effects of these poor management practices, as opposed to persuading CEOs one at a time or collectively, a la Business Roundtable, and telling them this is good for your company as well as for society.
I think your parallel with physical pollution is spot on. Walmart is discovered that actually if you put all this stuff on roofs and cut down waste is actually profitable because, it is solar energy can be cheap, and, it's all the extra cardboard is actually waste and all this other stuff. So we have discovered over time that actually it's much better and cheaper to stop putting stuff into the air, ground, and water. But it required legislation and regulation to do that. Waiting for companies to do that, we'd still be waiting. And similarly here, I really don't believe that waiting for companies, this is a very unpopular thing to say, but I believe it. If I want to stop, let me back up. How did OSHA stop all of the physical injuries that were written by Upton Sinclair in the jungle and all this other stuff? It was regulation. They didn't say, by the way, stop cutting people's arms off with chainsaw, with power saws in your factories, and stop having falls with ladders, whatever. There was a regulation and a workers' compensation insurance system that rewarded people with lower rates if they had a safer workplace. And I think the similar thing is going to happen with what I would call the psychosocial stressors, which are in many cases now worse than the physical risks. You can wait for a while, but you're going to wait for a long time to get companies to voluntarily do this. And the evidence is that in spite of the data that Gary has alluded to and other data on more micro level productivity studies, companies haven't done very much.
I mean, I think there's okay. Let me just recap for a moment, because I think several things that have been said that are super important. So, Jeff, you said if you look back at how we kind of addressed other social ills, whether that was slavery or child labor, and you could add, patriarchy and so on, it wasn't a utilitarian argument. Like at some point we had a consensus and we said, like, this is wrong. And so we might want to think a little bit about, like, how would you build such a consensus around labor practices and the labor environment? Secondly, Michaela, you were saying, this is kind of an externality. This imposes costs on our healthcare system. Jeff, you've said that, and so we need regulation to do that. The only slight pushback I'd say there is, yeah, but this is a case in which we know that doing the right thing also pays off for business. So that makes it a little bit more complicated. But what are your thoughts, Jeff, on how you've written extraordinarily persuasively about this, and people have been writing about it for some time. Like, what is missing in how we build a consensus, whether that's among leaders or whether that's more broadly across society? Like, what's missing in how we bring this issue to the fore?
Well, there's a lot missing, but let me give you, I think, one thing that stands out for me. So if Gary Hamel has come up through the ranks in, let's call it Hamel Enterprises, you are likely to have had personal connections with many of the people who work in that organization. And so you will know them, and you will have, because you know them personally, and because you've worked in the organization a reasonably long time, you will have a social identity and a social connection with them, which will be deeper than what's on some piece of paper, because you will have kind of grown up with them. You will have known them. You will have, okay. In today's world, when people come in increasingly from outside, they come in and they say, why should I be responsible or feel any obligation to Michele? Who the hell's Michele? I've never seen him before. I don't know who he is. I have no connection with him. And frankly, I have no real connection with the organization. I'm a hired gun. I've come in for a reasonably short period of time because, as you know, CEO tenures are also going down. They are there. It's like it's the difference between you and what you would do in a piece of land that you intended to live on throughout your life and then leave to your children. You would probably be a good steward of that piece of property in a way that you would not be if you were coming in and, plan to turn it over and speculate on it, where you would have a very different orientation towards a piece of land. I think the parallel with people is exactly the same. If you're going to be there for a short time, come and go, hired hand, no sense of identity and responsibility, you are going to treat that organization and those people very differently than you would if you had some sense of continuity, which is one of the reasons why, you haven't yet mentioned it, Gary, but I'm sure you will, Family businesses are different. They're different with respect to customer satisfaction. I still remember when Honda came to Stanford many, many, many years ago, gave some interesting talk. He's, of course, was a big character, and in those days,
The
General
founder,
Motors had
you mean, Sachiro Honda, the
had
founder of the company.
very poor quality cars. And, when somebody asked Mr. Honda why his cars were better quality than General Motors, he said, because when a car breaks down on the side of the road and the owner is cursing, they're cursing me. They're cursing my name. So I do believe that, and I think you would agree with this, that there's a fundamental different orientation to certainly to land, but also to people. If you have an ongoing long-term connection with and to them, than if you were just coming in and out. And so I think that's a piece, I think, of what's going on.
So you're saying that in effect, the organizations that have figured this thing out actually must be somewhat conscious about building social capital, about the value of that, about building stable relationships, how that aids problem solving and how that aids commitment, but that in the majority of cases, we have a very transactional view and we're looking at labor as another cost element and just simply saying, how do we get rid of that cost? Am I capturing that correctly?
I think that captures a piece of it. And the other difference is you look at a company which you may or may not have heard of, the Barry Waymiller, where Bob Chapman has written this book, Everybody Matters. Bob is, he's basically inherited this business from his father. He's been there for years. He's not going anywhere until he dies. You look at Herb Kelleher with Southwest Airlines. You look at, Jim Goodnight at SAS Institute. You look at George Zimmer, who then, of course, got thrown out of Men's Warehouse. It's now called Tailored Brands. You look at Patagonia. You look at most of these organizations. They have people who have been there a long time, and because they've been there a long time, have a sense of stewardship, a word that I choose intentionally, a sense of stewardship towards the organization, which is a very different orientation than somebody who comes in and says, I'm going to extract as much as I can, as quickly as I can, and then go on either to the next place or just retire.
So let me try to give you a counter case. And by the way, I agree with that. And I think, I've made that argument for a long time that many CEOs today basically have a mercenary mindset. And they know they have a limited period of time. They're looking to pop the share price, and the easiest way of doing that is financial engineering, share buybacks, buy one of your big competitors and take the consolidation gains, or go to Washington and renegotiate the playing field in your favor, right? So there's a few ways of trying to do that. But let me just give at least a little bit of a counterexample. So I think companies over the last few decades have done some really difficult things. Many of them have, that actually took a lot of effort and a considerable period of time. One of those was the re-engineering boom. And you'll remember back, in the 90s, that was a big thing. It meant really rethinking the whole organization, trying to break down the functional silos, thinking end to end about the supply chain. And a lot of companies have put enormous amount of effort into doing that. More recently, although almost all belatedly, they put a lot of effort into digital transformation, rethinking, how they reach customers and adopting social marketing and so on. So it's not that companies are never do things that are difficult or take some time to pay off. So what's different about this problem and despite the overwhelming evidence, because I think we have to solve it. We really have to get down to what makes this so difficult. And is it self-interest? Is it the CEO pay? But I'm interested on your take, because I feel if we can get down to what makes this particular thing so difficult, maybe we can then think about, all right, well, therefore, how do we tackle it?
Yeah. Well, companies have tackled digital transformation, but many of them did this only, after they were, their existence was, was at risk, and their competitors were already doing it, and they were severely threatened by the Amazons of life and everybody else. Companies certainly have invested in research and development, which oftentimes take a long time to pay off. You're asking me a question for which I really don't have a very good answer, because you're asking me to some extent the title of an article I once wrote, which is why, smart organizations do dumb things. And that is something that, you have your own work and your own experience. I mean, you've written many interesting things about strategy and you've written, I think you are the author of the famous phrase, 0 plus 0 still equals 0, about these, mergers which don't do anything. You take one crappy airline and put it together with another crappy airline. You now have a bigger airline that's still going to be just as bad. So I would ask you the same question you asked me. Why in a world, for instance, that is where the evidence consistently shows that mergers for the most part don't pay off? There's just so much interest in merging.
I hope you're enjoying the conversation. There's more of it to come. I just wanted to take a moment to thank Hire, the world's largest appliance maker and a global leader in the Internet of Things, for underwriting the costs of producing this interview. It's great to work with a partner who is so deeply committed to building organizations that elicit and deserve the very best that human beings can give. Now, back to our conversation. Well, let's go back to one of the articles you wrote, Jeff, which you do lay out kind of what you saw as the barriers here, and maybe it'd be interesting to brainstorm a little bit, and then let me turn this back to McKaylee too, because he'll want to add something to this. But one you said their mindsets that large companies are run by accountants and engineers. There's a particular way of looking at the world. We train people in a particular way. We train them to see human beings as resources. So you said there's some pretty deeply embedded mindsets. You also said that most organizations tend to do what's familiar to them, what other organizations around them are doing, what we've called the bureaucratic confederacy. So they're looking at other best practices, and by implication may not really have deep insight into what some of these more progressive organizations are doing. But you talk about just the weight of the familiar is one of the things. You talk about mindsets, and a third thing you talk about, which seems to me enormously important, is measurement. That our existing accounting systems don't pick up the invisible costs of the way we're treating people, nor the invisible gains that would be reaped if we change that. So and then you added the thing about the moral imperative. So if you take measurement, if you take this societal consensus around what is the right thing to do, if you take kind of the weight of the familiar, if you take the way we're training people mindsets, where in that do you think might be a lever? Even if you think about long-term faculty at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, where do you see some potential levers that we might grab hold of?
Well, I think measurement. I think I have said facetiously that if I had a lot of money, resources, and wanted to actually change the world, what I would do is hire the world's best computer hacker, of which there are now probably quite a number, and have them hack into the information systems at a Mercer or an Aon Hewitt, which has all, of course, the benefits information and health claims information. And they could, with that information, you could age adjust and, demography adjust, and you could publish a list of the 100 places that have the most excess deaths and excess medical claims compared to what would be expected given their population demographics. And that, you could do, instead of the 100 best companies, you're the 100 unhealthiest companies, and that would cause people, I think, to change. And the point of this kind of semi-facetious example is that, in fact, the data to measure what we are doing to people is already being collected. It is being collected in our health claims. It's being collected in the antidepressant prescriptions that are being written. I have a friend who works for an organization that I shouldn't mention, so I won't. And she said when she started working in this fancy Silicon Valley software firm, she went on antidepressants the first week. And she said she talked to many of her colleagues and they were all on antidepressants. And she said you could use antidepressant prescriptions literally as an indicator. And to some extent, you would need to adjust for a few things, but you could. So we have prescription data. We have medical claims data. We have potentially There's various organizations are doing surveys all the time of engagement and satisfaction and stress and all of these things. So the data is sitting there. Nobody wants to use them in this way. I think measurement is really the key. I think we pay attention to what we measure. And,
Yeah, and Jeff, can I ask you on that? Because I agree, as far as patient data or health outcomes data, there's plenty of that. But let me just give you a couple of examples where data is actually inconsistent or missing altogether. One is around the prevalence of these kinds of practices. So I checked the last time the US Bureau of Labor Statistics ran a large scale establishment survey to measure things like how much training are people getting on the job and what kind of training it is. And are they in self-managing teams? Are they cross-training? Are they getting information about financial performance of the company? That was 1995. All right. We haven't done anything. So there's a hodgepodge of other kinds of surveys that are put out, but nothing systematic and nothing at large scale, and certainly nothing over time that tracks any trend. So we're kind of flying blind, even though we're saying human capital is really important and training is really important. We have no idea as a country how much we're spending and how much we're getting out of that, right? And what kind of practice, how prevalent are these practices, right? So that, and I also, by the way, consulted a proposal from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which said, doing these kinds of surveys again in the 2020s would cost us like $10 million a year. No brainer. I mean, right? How difficult is that?
$10 million a year doesn't sound like a lot of money to me.
Right. Exactly. So given the amount of money we spend on training, right, which is in the tens of billions. But anyway, so that's one. The other kind of area of metrics, which is where there are gaps, I would think, is just around the bureaucratic drag and the cost of bureaucracy and lethargy and inertia. So, for instance, Bill Gates a few years ago basically said that his biggest mistake was letting Android emerge out of Google as opposed to having that come out of Microsoft. And he said, that cost Microsoft $400 billion in market value, right? But that's something that he kind of reasoned on, exposed, with one kind of example. But the cost of inertia, the cost of missed opportunity, the cost of inefficiency is not really measured. And there's nothing in their accounting system that allows investors, anybody, to really hold executives accountable for those things, right? And so, aren't there things that we ought to do, both in terms of measuring these practices and in the accounting itself, that could help really catalyze some action here?
Yes, absolutely. There is a thing called, I think, the Social Accountability or Sustainability Board, SASB, run by the former Harvard professor Bob Eccles, who I know well. And they are working to try to improve or enhance reporting around the issue of environmental sustainability. But Michele's point, which I think is exactly right, is that ought to be broadened to consider measures of and indicators of human sustainability, not just environmental impact, such as how much recycling we're doing and what our carbon footprint is. As I tell my friends all the time, humans are carbon life forms. So if you want to know your carbon imprint, you want to look at the imprint on the carbon life forms that are working for you. But no, I agree with that. I think our measurements have been too constricted and too limited. And there is now this movement, led in part by Larry Fink of BlackRock, but other people as well, to try to broaden out into what I guess is called ESG. And certainly to the extent, we think people are important, which I think we should, that could be part of that effort. Absolutely. But that's been talked about. As Michele knows, I mean, that's been talked about for a long time. The idea of measuring human capital better and putting it on the balance sheet and understanding that when you lay people off, you actually haven't probably cut your costs. You may have actually increased your costs by losing all this experience and all this knowledge and whatever. So this has been discussed for a while. Nothing much has happened. So we could turn Gary's question to you and say, given that this has been on the table for a while and people have talked about it, we still haven't made very much progress.
No, but this could suggest like a grand new project for people writing, for business school faculty and OB. What we really don't need is any more accounts of good work practices. Like we have enough of that. We get it. We know that adds value. What we don't have is really good ways of measuring it. What we don't have is a standard scoreboard. In the book Michele and I wrote, Humanocracy, we talked about how a book written in 1999, a report called To Err is Human, kind of first brought all the data together systematically around the cost of medical errors, unnecessary errors in medicine, and the estimate was about 100,000 lives a year were being lost. And literally within months, the Clinton administration had passed a law that this data would henceforth be collected systematically. It launched an enormous movement around quality of health care. And so, Jeff, who needs to get involved? Who needs to be part of something that would say, okay, enough is enough. Let's start collecting this data. It does not cost that much money. Let's start putting pressure on companies to report this. We do it around.
Well, I think you've answered your own question. Michele has answered the question. So Michele talks about the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which used to do these surveys. And I remember these surveys. I didn't know they hadn't been done since 1995. Time flies when you're having fun, but I could certainly believe that it's been 1995. You talk, Gary, about the Clinton administration and the Institute of Medicine and all these other organizations and CMS, the Center for Medicare, and all these other places that have mandated certain measurements for hospitals, including readmission rates and everything else. So clearly there is a role. There's a role for some centralized body, which probably ought to be the government, to make sure this data is collected in a systematic fashion and reported out. Canada actually apparently records and reports companies' environmental performance, so I think you've answered your own question. Waiting for the companies to do this voluntarily, it's going to take longer than anybody has, I think.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions that Michele and I have debated a lot, and if you look back, Jeff, and you have a bit of gray hair, I have a bit of gray hair. If you look back over the last 40 or 50 years of innovation in HR, whether that is quality of work life, whether that was self-managing teams, all the way back to T groups, and then you look at everything all the way up to mindfulness training and now agile teams. It seems to us not much of that has really made a difference. I mean, many of those experiments made a big difference and produced very positive results, but very few took root in the organizations that did this experimentation. Often these things ultimately were aborted or marginalized. And again, you kind of get this deeper question that goes like, wow, we've been working on these things for so long. We produced a lot of positive results. And I have to say that for me, one of the things I'm trying to avoid, Jeff, is to die a bitter old man, because, when I talk to some of the folks who've been management faculty professors, and I'm not going to name names, but you talk to them, in the last few years of their life, and they're just kind of bitter. They're going like, I don't know why these companies haven't figured this out. It was so obvious. We told them, and so on. And so as you reflect on all of that history, why hasn't it made more impact? And maybe we're just now restating what we've already talked about, but I'm just curious of whether even the way we think about what we do as business schools and management researchers, whether something needs to change, because it seems to me the impact has been pretty marginal.
I would not disagree with anything you said, and what is missing is, again, what we've already alluded to and talked about, is some kind of mandate. So and a mandate with some teeth in it. So 100 years ago, or it's got probably now close to 100 years ago, we decided that it was not useful or moral to kill people in factories, and so we created the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and we gave them some teeth, not as many teeth as they probably needed, but we gave them teeth, and we gave them also the ability to measure. So you can actually go and you can see the decline in workplace accidents and in workplace deaths and what the causes are, and they publish reports, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which this is a part of, publishes reports on this, and you can see the systematic improvement that we have done with an enforcement agency, and so we've already talked about this several times. If you want anything to be done, there has to be some push. There has to be some teeth. There has to be some, something that's pushing it forward. And that's true whether we're cleaning up the environment and the air, water, and ground, or whether it's, cleaning up the workplace and putting in better management practices. And it's interesting, as you may recall, which I'm sure you do, under Clinton, Robert Reich set up a subunit.
The Secretary of Labor.
Yes, the Secretary of Labor set up a subunit within the Department of Labor to do exactly what we're talking about, to try to replicate what the Agricultural Extension Service had done for agriculture for workplaces. And I see McKelly nodding his head, so you remember this. It disappeared.
Yeah.
Clinton goes, Reich goes, the agency goes, everything goes, And so we do not have the same kind of effort of diffusing best practices that has occurred, for instance, in agriculture with the Agricultural Extension Service, which at one point in this nation's history, when farming was much more economically significant, was incredibly important for capturing best practices, diffusing them. You had agricultural extension agents who would go, if you were running a farm, and help you figure out how the best way to doing all this stuff. And anyway,
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and the sad thing, Jeff, I think it was called the Office of the American Workplace, and I think the sad thing is that the practices or the agenda for improving labor conditions that they put out is much more sophisticated and ambitious than what passes now as good jobs. Now good jobs are mainly about, let's pay people a decent amount of money, give them health benefits, make sure they can control their schedule somewhat, but it's like the lowest possible bar. Right. And it used to be much more ambitious. I mean, I think the sad thing for me is that the bar has actually been lowered in the last 20 years.
Expectations are going down.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Jeff, can I ask?
And
Yeah, go ahead.
you remember correctly, it was called that. And you are certainly correct that they were very much imbued, because the staff was very much imbued with the kinds of research that Gary has nicely described and you have nicely described, and they understood this, and their job, they thought, was to be and they actually, I think, were actually explicitly paralleled the Agricultural Extension Service, that our job was to go and help companies implement this stuff because it will help the companies.
Yeah, and for those
As
of you
well
who
as
may
helping
not
the
know
workers.
about the U.S. Department of Agriculture and those extension services, it was basically a way of collecting data, evidence-based data, and getting that to local farmers all across the country to improve crop yields and so on. So it was this concerted effort to level up agricultural practices. And what you're saying is we really haven't seen anything like that when it comes to work practices.
That's correct. And the effort that we once had on that disappeared because I think one year I wrote a Fortune column around Labor Day about how America's declared a war on jobs, and it's really true. We have people, the Chamber of Commerce and these other huge organizations fight any increase in the minimum wage. They have fought tooth and nail any even unpaid leave, let alone paid leave. They fight tooth and nail, which is one of the reasons why the United States, as you will both know, has the lowest percentage of college-educated women in the labor force of any of our major industrialized countries, because we are the country, even though we talk about being family friendly, we're not. We have horrible work family policies. So the business community has not only not embraced what you're talking about, collectively they have fought it. They have fought, any, in California, the companies just spent over $200 million to make sure that so the gig workers would have essentially no protections, or only protections that they deign to give them. No health care, no workers' comp, no paid time off. This is the only country in the world. 25% of the U.S. workforce has no paid time off. You both know that.
Yeah,
vacation. No, I go to other countries, as I'm sure you have also. You tell people this, they don't even believe you. So I've decided when I now go up and go give a talk somewhere and I talk about how the U.S. has no mandatory paid time off, you better bring an article with you because they won't believe you. They can't believe that in a sophisticated, wealthy country in the 21st century would not mandate even sick days. And it's one of the reasons why COVID spreads in the way it does is because, I may be sick, but I can't afford to take any time off because, of course, I'm not paid for my sick time.
Well, what that argues, I think is that we still have this incredibly zero sum way of thinking about labor costs. And and you could argue, I think a lot of CEOs today would argue. They say, listen, the U.S. is the most competitively exposed economy in the world. If you don't offshore, if you don't outsource, if you don't rely on the gig economy, how do we compete? And you can agree or disagree, but as a society, we have not said like this is unacceptable.
That's correct. That's correct. Just as we have said, not to, at one point we decided to say that slavery was unacceptable. You need to decide, that it is unacceptable to have the level. And Michele, I think, used exactly the right term. We have externalized these costs. And we know, we know that the price system works wonderfully, but only if the price captures things. If the price system doesn't capture stuff because I'm able to externalize the costs, then I'm going to overproduce. I'm going to overproduce pollution because I'm not paying for the pollution I create. I'm going to overproduce social ill health, both mental and physical, because I'm not forced to pay for this. And if you look at the countries, it's not by accident that the countries that are doing the most along the lines that we're now discussing, they are in the European Union. And the reason why they're interested in it is not because they're so enlightened. It's because I had somebody in the UK tell me, look, when people make people sick, we pay for it collectively, and we're tired of letting the companies just pass their costs on. So the Michele's term of externalization is exactly right. And if you want companies to behave better, you can't let them pass their costs onto the larger society.
Well, and what you could argue is, in some cases like pollution, we make a choice as a society. We say, we are going to deal with this, and we recognize that, in the short term at least, that puts a crimp. We're going to pay more to have cleaner air, cleaner water, and so on. And as a society, we've made that choice. What makes this particularly difficult to understand around labor practices is this is not, this is a positive thing, right? This is not something where we have to say, we're willing to forgo certain levels of personal mobility, or we're going to raise the price of cars because, we're going to go to electric vehicles. And this is a both and yet it's still been so difficult to make it happen. Let's take a last question or two, Jeff. I'd like to ask you one, and I bet Michele will have another one. So let's turn this around for a moment. If you have, let's say, a relatively young CEO come to you, maybe a company that has a few thousand employees, not 20,000, 50,000, and it says like, listen, Jeff, I've read what you've said. I understand the power of these practices to create value. But I'm hiring people as we grow who come from traditional companies and manage in traditional ways. They bring that all that old thinking. Maybe my investors are not totally on board with this. Like, what do I do? But I still have a lot of influence. I am the CEO. What is your advice to me about how I make sure I go down the right road here?
I think you educate them. So years ago, I went to Holy Cross Hospital because Holy Cross Hospital decided it was going to undergo a transformation. And, and I did a board retreat with them, and you educate the board about the realities, and you show them the data, and you show them the evidence. And I think the question's a good one. You need to bring everybody along, and you bring them along through something that you have spent your life doing. And Michele spent his life doing. You educate them. You show them the data. After showing them the data, you do the next thing, which is to say, okay, if we're going to do this, how are we going to do this, and what is your role in this going to be, and how will we know that we're making progress? I don't think this is that hard to do if you're serious about it. So I'm sure have seen this as well. So Amir Dan Rubin becomes CEO of Stanford Healthcare in, I think, 2010. Stanford Healthcare, 5th percentile in the emergency department, 40th percentile patient satisfaction, huge issues with infection control and everything else. Took them 1 year. Didn't take 100 years. Basically, we're serious about this. We're going to change. We're going to change out people who aren't willing to do things in a new way. And we are going to have continuous improvement. I mean, it's the quality movement. It's not hard. We're going to measure. I'm going to go to each of my department heads and we're going to say, how would we know that we're doing better? And we're going to measure things and we're going to have, the famous, like the quality thing. You see the charts on the wall. There were charts on his wall. There are charts all over the organization. What's your waiting time for an appointment? What's our infection rate? Pardon me. What's our readmission rate? What's our whatever, we're going to involve people. He went to the transport. These are the people who push the wheelchair, push the beds to the hospital. And he said, how would you know if you're doing a better job? And it turns out you talk to patients. So it turns out that you can push people forward or backward. It's both of them will transport them. And most people like seeing where they're going, not where they've been. So, we're going to do all these little tiny simple things. We're going to introduce people. When you come into the room, you do what he calls CI care. You're going to introduce yourself. You say, Gary, I'm here. This is why I'm here. This is who I am. This is what we're going to do. This is why we're doing it. It's tiny little simple things. But all of them collectively made an enormous difference and quickly. And he had tons of training and tons of meetings and tons of basically emphasis on process. And he would call this SOS, the Stanford Operating System. And so it's the same principle as Toyota applied to healthcare. I mean, obviously you're doing different things. It's the same thing that when airlines decided to be safe. Why are airlines, at least in the U.S., so safe? They're not so safe because we have like brilliantly skilled pilots. We're safe because we have spent decades putting out standards and procedures and processes and teaching people about them and why they work and how they work, and then listening to people. So if we have a near accident or a near miss, what can we learn from this? And how do we incorporate the learning to make sure it doesn't happen again? And you've alluded to the 100,000 lives, and of course, the famous 100,000 Lives Project. I mean, this is not hard to do if we're serious about our intent. And so it begins with seriousness of purpose.
Yeah, wow. I think that's a brilliant summary. And I think, you said earlier, yes, this is a systemic change and it is difficult, but it's not impossible. And and I think a lot of leaders might believe, well, like I'm going to work on this for years and then maybe there's a payback. And I think what you're saying is almost from the beginning, even if you start small, like, yes, it's going to be hard to build that culture, make it sustainable, but you're going to see like a payoff right away. This is not like pie in the sky by and by.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct.
If I can ask one more question, Jeff, and it really is about the role of business education in sort of maybe helping us move forward and make progress. And because one of the things that we noticed as we were doing research, for our book, we looked at Hire, Southwest, Nucor, Morningstar, W.L. Gore, Vinci, Handelsbanken, all these companies, and there are quite a few around the world. And one of the things that were very different in terms of business model and industry and geography, but they all had one thing in common: they had very few MBAs. Literally, I mean, I
can believe that.
And so and maybe it's a coincidence. I don't know. Maybe you don't. But I'd love to get your take on how can business education be reimagined to kind of be supportive of this new, of these new practices, this new way of conceiving individuals at work, and maybe the question to make it super practical would be, if you were appointed dictator of Stanford GSB, with unlimited resources for the next 5 years, what kind of changes would you make?
Well, I think business education reflects the culture rather than shapes it. And so while I think many people point to business education as a problem, we've taught, Jensen and Meckling that shareholders are primary, and we've taught, all kinds of other things. I think we are a reflection of the business culture. I don't think we actually have very much power to shape it, to be brutally honest. So I would push back, I think, on that. I do think it is, so this Stanford student comes to me and says, I've been in touch with these students at MIT, and we think that it is a travesty and a tragedy that you can go through Stanford Business School and never hear the word labor union. That you can leave Stanford and never, you don't know the history of labor unions, you don't understand what they do, you don't understand what they are, you don't understand anything about them. We think it's awful. And you, by the way, can now go through Stanford. We used to have a required human resource management course that was part of the core. By the way, the most popular part of the core. When my friend Charles O'Reilly and I and some other people taught it, it's gone. So you can go through Stanford, never take a course in human resource management, never take a class that touches on anything that you and Gary have talked about. So we could put that back in the core, I suppose. But I think we reflect what students want to do and how they think about their education. I'm not sure that imposing this is going to accomplish much. By the way, the parallel I would draw is with business ethics. So we had all the scandals companies put in business ethics. As near as I can determine, the evidence on the effect of ethics training on behavior is not much that anybody's ever been able to find. So I'm not sure that that's going to be the solution. I think the solution comes much more from what you have and Gary have been talking about, which is maybe a social movement. I'm told by people that, that the young generation, I'm told by my friend who runs, Russ Glass, who runs Ginger, which is a mental health provider, that the young generation won't tolerate what older people have tolerated in terms of the absence of support for stress and depression and all kinds of behavioral health issues. We'll see. I don't know, but it's not going to come from business schools.
Well, some of us who are in business schools are still going to do our best, but I think your pessimism is probably still justified, Jeff. That they kind of reflect demand more than they shape demand, and from employers. Jeff, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you. I hope we find a way of having common cause in this as we go forward. So, thank you for your time. Thank you for pointing us to the fact this is a social problem with real social costs, and we're either going to get serious about it or not. And also pointing us to the fact that if you're an individual leader and you want to do this, there are no insuperable barriers that prevent you from taking the lead. So it is up to us both as individual leaders and as citizens and people at work to try to make this better.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure spending time with you both.